So in chapter 2, I'm going to do a little bit of a background on Matthew as we get started tonight. Matthew is, I think, kind of an interesting character and an unusual choice to be one of Jesus' disciples because he was a tax collector for the hated Romans. In chapter 9, we read that he was sitting in his tax booth when Jesus came by and issued the invitation to follow him, which Matthew knew as a Jew was actually the invitation to be a disciple, which was this highly privileged position, as we have taught so many times here at Calvary Chapel over the years. One of the burdens those conquered by the Romans had to endure was to pay the empire taxes. Taxes were levied on all kinds of things, on travel, on products that were produced, on land, on buildings. The Romans were much like our government today. If they could tax it, they taxed it. People would go to a tax office, they would give their name would be listed on the register, their bill would be totaled because there would be an inventory of how much land they had or how many properties or how many boats or whatever, that they wanted to do a tax. And so they would have, okay, here's your bill, and then they would pay that bill on set times. They would get a tax receipt proving that they had squared up with the tax man. Now, Romans bid out the job of collecting taxes to the locals. It wasn't Roman officials that collected them. It was locals. It was the native people that they had conquered. And so the Romans would bid out this job, and people competed for the job to be a tax collector because though it was a hated position, just think about this. The Romans are they're conquerors. And here we're paying taxes to a foreign entity. And our money in our land that we're producing is leaving. It's going to Rome. And now we have some of our own people, our neighbors, that are collecting taxes for the Roman. You can imagine that. Those people weren't liked very much. But you can make a lot of money as a tax collector. And so there were always people that were willing to bid for that. I'll put up with the hatred of my neighbors because it'll make me rich. And that was the case. Matthew, or Levi, as his real name is, was probably a young man. We've talked about this before. All of the disciples at the time of their calling by Jesus were in fact teenagers. Peter was the only one who was over 20. And don't have time to get into that now, but he's more than likely, Matthew, is he's a teenager at this point. And so this is the family business. No doubt it was his father that had obtained the tax franchise. The tax collectors then would make their money. They would know how much money an area was supposed to produce. The Romans would tell them, we want this amount of money over this region that you've been given responsibility for. And then it was up to the tax collectors to figure out how to get that. And their money came from padding the amount a little bit. The way they were able to do that is they were the only ones that knew how much money was to be collected. They could tell how much was needed to be collected from the people they were collecting it from. And so they would always pad it enough, of course, to make money for themselves. Now, the Romans were the enforcement end of that. If a tax collector said, hey, this guy hasn't paid his taxes, it would be Roman officials that would go out and collect the tax. The Romans had to play a balancing game here, and you can understand why. They wanted taxes, right? But they also didn't want the locals rebelling. And so there was this game of, well, let's make sure we get our money, but let's not allow the tax person to be so oppressive in their taxation out of just simple greed, trying to get rich themselves, that the people rebel against that. And so there was this balancing game that had to be played. Tax collectors, of course, had to keep very careful records. So Matthew would have been a skilled scribe, a talent that would serve him well as he becomes one of those that writes the story of Jesus. And besides the account of his call by Jesus as a disciple in chapter 9, Matthew is mentioned only in passing in the Gospels. His name is given in the lists of the 12 disciples, but that's really all that's said of him. That's all that we know. Tradition says that after the resurrection, Matthew spent 12 years in Israel, helping to build up the church there, but then he traveled abroad preaching the gospel. He wrote his story of Jesus, his gospel, sometime in the 50s or early 60s. And anyone who's read the Gospels of Matthew and Mark know how similar they are. In fact, there are whole passages where they're word for word the same. And it looks like one of them copied the other. But please hear me, that is not the case. Matthew didn't copy Mark. Mark didn't copy Matthew. Their accounts contain the same material because both of them are a record of the oral tradition that arose right after Jesus' resurrection. Think about the way education was done in the ancient world. Did schools have textbooks in the ancient world? No. How was it done? Well, a teacher would teach, and the reason they were a teacher was because they had memorized the material. And the way that it worked was like this. A teacher would have students, young people, and they would be sitting in a class, typically, of course, in Jews, boys on one side, girls on the other. Because remember, girls were given an education, especially up in Galilee, to the age of 10. And they memorized the entire Old Testament word for word. Okay? Well, the Torah, I should say. Between 6 and 10, they memorized the entire first five books of the Bible. And that's what it was. It was memorization. So the teacher would say a line, and all the students would repeat it out loud. And then they would do it again, and they would repeat it out loud. How many of you have memorized some scripture? Raise your hand. Okay, so you know this. The more you memorize, the easier it gets, right? Memory's like a muscle. When you first try to memorize something, it's like, it's really hard. But the more you memorize, the easier it gets. It's kind of like a muscle. Your brain starts working in that way. And so when you've memorized a lot of stuff, memorizing new stuff is easier. So here's all these early church, they're all Jews. They have memorized large bodies of things. Hey, think about this, families. Families knew their ancestry going back generations. How do they know that? Well, because they grew up with their parents repeating to them, you know, this is your grandfather's name, this is your great-grandfather's name, this is your great-great-grandfather. And they could go back many generations because they had memorized their names and their stories, and they all knew their family lineage. How? By memory. So remember that. This is how people learned. They would hear a teacher teach, and they would repeat it out loud, and they would keep doing it until they had it memorized. Right, okay. So what do we read about in the book of Acts? Right after the resurrection of Jesus, it says that those that were there on the day of Pentecost, they met in the temple grounds to hear the apostles teach. Can you picture that scene? 3,000 of them get saved on the day of Pentecost. Of course, many of them were visitors to Jerusalem, and they returned home. But there were hundreds of people that had come to faith there. So imagine this church of several hundred people. They gather in the temple court because it's a big open area. And the apostles get up, and they begin to teach on the life of Jesus. Now, they had heard Jesus teach many times. Please hear me. When Jesus would come to Caesarea and he would teach, he would repeat the same words in Tiberias. When he would go then to Nazareth, when he would go to Capernaum. Why? Well, because this is a new audience. He's sharing the same information. Don't get the idea that every message that Jesus gave was a unique message because it was on the radio, right? It's a new group of people, and he's teaching them. So how many times did the disciples hear these messages? Again and again and again. And they were in this mode of memorizing. He's the rabbi. We're supposed to be memorizing, hearing what he's saying. So now when they get up, can you understand, what are they saying? The same message. When we were with Jesus, here's the message that he taught us. And then here's the Sermon on the Mount. Because they had memorized it. Am I making sense? Okay. So these hundreds of new believers that are there, they're very quickly picking up the story of Jesus. They're the story of where he went and what he did, but most importantly, his teaching. And they're memorizing it. So this oral tradition builds up because they didn't have this. They didn't have books. By and large, these people didn't own a single book. Why? Too expensive. They were hand copies. How about scrolls? Same thing. Very expensive. These people simply didn't have that kind of material. They had it in here. They had it in here. They had it memorized. And so this oral tradition built up where someone then could leave the Temple Mount and go and and tell their neighbor, here's what I learned about Jesus. And then they get saved and they start attending. They learn the story, and this oral tradition builds up. So now, when it comes time for Matthew to write down and Mark to write down, what are they writing down? That oral tradition. And that's why they're so similar. One didn't copy the other. They're both simply putting into writing the oral tradition that had built up around the life of Jesus. That's why the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic Gospels, because they are synopsis of the life of Jesus. When John comes along and he writes his, which is he does sometime after Matthew, Mark, and Luke are already in circulation. He already knows about them. And he says, well, I'm not going to write the same thing. I'm not going to record the oral tradition. I'm going to write the stuff they left out. And so his stories kind of fill in a lot of the details on why his gospel appears very different from theirs. Now, as Rob shared last week, Matthew wrote his gospel primarily to a Jewish audience with the intent of proving that Jesus was their Messiah and their King. Verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the Great, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So Matthew mentions now a key player in the story of Jesus' early days, this guy Herod the Great, or Herod the First. He's called the Great because of what he did. Listen, this guy was a megalomaniac of epic proportions. This guy had a superiority complex. He single-handedly transformed Israel from a nameless backwater to an urbane and modern nation at that time. His extensive and elaborate building projects became known across the Roman Empire. And many of his building projects remain to this day. They're ruins, of course, but I want to show you some pictures and talk just briefly about some of the main things that people do when we go to Israel. We visit these places because they're simply fascinating. So the first is Masada. How many of you have heard of Masada? Okay. Masada is a fortress that Herod the Great built out in the Jordan Valley. It's a long way from anything. It's out in the desert. It's built on the top of a mountain with very sheer sides. And Herod's plan was this. He wanted a place that he could flee to with his family if there was ever a rebellion. And so, but this is a long way from Jerusalem. But he thought, okay, so we'll go out here in the desert, and it'll make it hard for anybody to come and lay siege to us because they won't have any supplies. There's no water, there's no trees, there's nothing out here. It's desert. So what he did is he built a city on top of this mountain, and then he put huge warehouses in it, and he kept them stocked with fresh food and water. So you could outlast any kind of siege in this place. And so that's what he did. He built this. You can see the special buildings that he built and baths and everything on the north side. And all of these, they built gardens up there, and they brought water up. They had to carry water up. But of course, he had servants to do that because the guy was quite powerful. So that's Masada. The ruins exist to this day. Herod had spent time in Rome. It's one of the ways that he ended up becoming king of Israel, was because he had ingratiated himself with the emperor. And so he had gotten to know some people in Rome, and he wanted to make Masada this grand fortress and castle. And so to decorate it, he hired some Roman masons and artists to come. And they couldn't there's no marble out in this area. But so what he did is he had walls plastered, and then he had artists paint them so it looks like marble. And it exists to this day. Now, most of it's been, eroded off, but there are certain little places you're walking along and here's this little plaster and it looks like marble. And it's just actually hand painted, faux marble. It's pretty cool. So that's Masada. He built the famous Herod's Temple, the temple complex in Jerusalem. It was stunning. This building Herod built this because he wanted to ingratiate himself to the Jews because he had been made their king. He wasn't of the line of David. He wasn't even Jewish. He was an Edomite. And he had, through clever means and conspiracy, he had acquired the throne of Israel. But he really wanted the Jews to love him, to honor and respect him. And so he built them a temple, a glorious temple. It was glorious. In fact, believe it or not, pagans heard about the beauty of the Jewish temple and would travel to Israel just to see the Jewish temple. And it caused some of them, when they saw it, to say, there must be truth in the Jewish religion that it would prompt people to make this. And so then they would learn about the God of Israel. And that's how some Gentiles ended up becoming Jews, was simply by visiting the temple and being so impressed with what they saw. So that's the Jewish temple. So Herod realized, Masada is way too far away. What if there's a rebellion and while I'm trying to get there, they overtake me and kill me? So he made another fortress just a few miles from Jerusalem called Herodium. It was a flat plain, and in those days, you want to try to put your fortress on top of a hill because it's harder to conquer. And so he says, okay, I want you guys to make me a fortress here. And they go, but there's no high place. And he goes, so make the high place first and then put the fortress on top of it. So the hill that's there, that you see there, that's a man-made hill. Pile up the dirt and then put the fortress on top of it. But there isn't enough space up on the top for the grandeur of Herod, so he had this other palace built at the foot of it. Now you can still see this hill from Jerusalem today. When you're standing in Jerusalem on the south side, you look towards the south, east, and there's this conical hill, and you can tell it's man-made, and it's the hill. And we go there and look at the ruins to this city of Caesarea by the sea, or Caesarea Maritima. So Herod wanted to make Israel into something special. He had been in Rome. He says, Israel, nobody knows about Israel. Let's make it grand. So to do that, you need trade. You need to have a port where ships in the Mediterranean can come in and bring trade, and that you can export your products. The problem is, Israel doesn't have any good harborage on the Mediterranean. There's the old little tiny port of Joppa. Remember, for Jonah left from there. But that only holds a couple of ships. And all it is then it's just a beach. And so he says, well, we need a port. And so he tells his engineers and his architects, he says to them, build me a port. And they go, well, we can't do that. And he goes, I want one. And they said, well, we can't do that. And he goes, well, figure it out. So what they did, they had to make a port. They couldn't dig into the land. They decided to make the port out on the water. There was this little city that was right in the middle of the land called Caesarea. And he says, go ahead and, it was called something else. He renamed it Caesarea after Caesar. He says, make it here. So what these guys did is they built a huge breakwater out into the sea to enclose the sea so that they could bring ships in and they could unload them in calm water. So they made a breakwater. And to this day, we do not know how they did it. They found some way to make a cement that cures underwater. So they would float these wood forms, these square wood forms, out into the water, and they would pour this cement mixture in there, and then they would remove the wooden forms, and it would drop to the bottom and harden, and then they would put another one on top of it, and they made this huge breakwater, enough for dozens of ships to be able to come in and unload. Herod. Would you guys agree with me? He's kind of nuts. That's how powerful he was. Make me a harbor. Well, we can't. Okay, well, take their heads off and bring in the next group. Okay, we can do it. Yeah. That's Herod. Joseph and Mary lived up north, of course, in Nazareth, because that's where the work was at the time. But they had to return to their ancestral hometown of Bethlehem because of a Roman census. Rome required people to be counted at their permanent dwelling place. And Joseph and Mary, their hometown was, of course, Bethlehem. But the work was up north. It was in Nazareth because Herod was building. He didn't like the capital of the northern province of Galilee. It was down, it was hot, it was a smell of sulfur because there were hot springs there was mosquitoes and malaria. He hated it. And he said, build me a new capital for the north up in the mountains where there's breezes. And so they were building a new city called Sepphoris. And so that's where the work was. And of course, what was Joseph? What was his trade? Construction worker. He was a teknon. He was a construction worker. And so that's where the work was. And so that's why they're up there in Nazareth. But the census comes, and so they have to return to their permanent dwelling place for the counting there. While they were there, Jesus was born. And Luke tells us that when Jesus was 8 days old, as required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to the temple in Jerusalem to be circumcised, which was an easy trip because it's just 4 miles from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Then they returned to Bethlehem for Mary to recover before making the trip back north to Nazareth. But something remarkable took place while they were there and she was recovering. Important dignitaries arrived in the capital, in Jerusalem. They were from the distant east. Now, the word for wise men here is the word magi. It's a Persian word roughly equal to what we would say astronomer. These magi had been looking to the heavens in their eastern home when they saw a sign that provoked their curiosity. And as they researched it, they discovered that it was a portent of a notable ruler who would arise among the Jews. And so they came to Israel in search of him. Now, what drew the Magi's, what they drew their insights from, what's the meaning of this celestial thing that we're seeing? We don't know. We have no idea what it was, but it was clearly a true prophecy, right? Because that's exactly what it was. It was a king of the Jews that had been born. And so Bible students and scholars believe that what happened was this was a prophecy of Daniel. Remember that the Jews had been carried into exile. Daniel was one of those, he was a young boy. He's taken to Babylon. He gets selected to be raised in the education of the Babylonian court. We know he becomes this important dignitary. He was a prophet with many prophecies of the future. And it's possible that he prophesied that this event would happen one day. These guys are looking to the heavens. They see this new celestial event, where it's located in the sky. They go to their books and they start researching. Oh, it says here that when we see that sign in that place in the heavens, it means this. And it was in fact true. It was correct. And so they come to do honor to this new king that is being born. So they apparently, though, and as we'll read a little bit later, it says the star appeared to them. They arrive in the land of Israel when there's clouds. It's probably the rainy season. And now there's clouds, and at night you can't see the stars if there's a cloud cover up there. And so they lose sight of this, and as they get to Israel, they go, well, where should we go to get information? Surely the religious leaders in the temple and the rulers of Israel, they must know about this. We'll just go to Jerusalem and ask them, where's this new king been born? And that's what happens. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. What troubled Herod was the Magi's remark that they had come seeking him who had been born king of the Jews. You see, Herod was super paranoid when it came to the throne, and he had every reason to be. He had stolen it from those that it belonged to. He wasn't Jewish, as I said. He was a descendant of the Edomites, the ancient enemies of the Jews. But he had ingratiated himself with the Romans and managed to maneuver himself onto Israel's throne. Herod used murder to get and to keep the kingship. He even killed members of his own family when he suspected them of conspiring against him. Motivated by paranoia and cruelty, he murdered a good portion of the Jewish Sanhedrin. He murdered his favorite wife and his mother-in-law. That may be understandable. That was mean. And 3 of his sons. His favorite wife, Mariamne, he loved her. But somebody told him that she was conspiring with her sons to steal the throne. And so he killed her and 3 of his sons. Now, his greatest fear was that someone from the royal dynasty of David would rise up, rally the Jews, and rebel against him. And so the Magi's news disturbed him greatly. When Herod was upset, so was everyone else. Notice what it says there. It says that he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. And here's why. When Herod was troubled, he caused trouble. There's a story, true story about Stalin. One night after he's in power in Moscow, he's trying to sleep, and there's a dog that he hears barking. And now that he hears this dog, it's like all he can hear, and he can't get to sleep, and he starts getting more and more angry. He calls in a guard, and he says, find that dog and kill it and its owner. Okay, Herod and Stalin, very similar. This man was incredibly cruel. To give you an idea of how cruel Herod was, and this phrase, he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Herod knew that by the time it came to the time when he knew that he would be passing soon, everyone despised him, hated him, including his own family members, obviously. And so he gave an order to his personal guard that when he died, when they received word that he died, they were to go out and to find a bunch of Jerusalem's most respected citizens, Jewish citizens, and kill them, so that there would be mourning in Jerusalem when he died. Now, fortunately, when he died, the guards went, nah, let's not do that. But that gives you an idea of just how cruel this man was. So here, if Herod is troubled by the Magi's query, so is everyone else. Because if he's troubled, it's going to be trouble for others. Verse 4. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And so they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who shall shepherd my people Israel. So interesting, isn't it, that all of these learned men could quote chapter and verse of the prophecies of Micah in chapter 5, verse 2, regarding where the Messiah was to be born? But they had no interest in seeking him themselves. You've got these guys coming a long way from the east. If they're coming from the area of Persia, which is what we believe they were coming from, because the word that's used to describe them is a Persian word, that's a long way. And these guys have 4 miles to go, and they're not interested. This is not unlike some people today who can, parse the Greek text, develop a neat systematic theology. They can outline the biblical text with skill, but they fail to see that all of it points to Jesus. They can't see the forest for the trees. They have lost the word of God in the words of the Bible. Verse 7, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also, worship him also. So, of course, Herod's plan was to get rid of Jesus, not worship him. The child was a threat, a competitor to be squashed, as Herod had so ruthlessly done to so many before. So he calls for the Magi secretly because he's paranoid that yet another conspiracy is afoot, trying to use the Magi to their own ends. Verse 9, and when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them until it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. So Matthew's account suggests that the original celestial sign that the Magi had seen in their eastern home, for some reason it disappeared for a time. And again, very likely that's due to the weather. A cloudy sky would obscure their stargazing. But now, as they set out for Bethlehem, the sky's cleared and the star reappears. Now, there's been endless attempts to identify what this star was. There are some rather interesting ancient records that refer to celestial events that occurred right around this time. This may have been a conjunction of planets. It may have been a nova. It may have been a comet. Interesting prospect that it was a comet, because this thing seems to lead them to Israel from the east. And comets move through the sky. So it's possible that this has led them, and as they arrive in Bethlehem, where is it? It's directly overhead. So before, it was leading them towards the west, towards Israel, but now as they arrive, it's now directly overhead. They know that they're in the right place. Verse 11, and when they had come into the house, note that, they entered a what? A house. Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus are no longer in a apparent stable. The crowds that had filled Bethlehem for the census have returned home, so they found better accommodations. Verse 11, and when they come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's because of three gifts being mentioned here that the tradition has arisen that there were three magi, three wise men. That's not said. No number for the magi is given. The words, when they had opened their treasures, suggest that there were more. But the treasures that they brought were of only three kinds. Chief among the gifts given to Jesus were gold, which is befitting a king; frankincense, a gift appropriate for a priest because it represents prayer; and then myrrh. Myrrh was an expensive spice that was used mainly as an embalming spice. These gifts were treasures, each of them of considerable value. They were gifts appropriate to who the Magi understood this King of the Jews to be. He was a prophet, a priest, and a king. Have you ever had a hard time thinking of a good gift for someone? Do you know someone who you dread birthdays and Christmas because, oh man, what am I going to buy? What am I going to get them? Here's a good practical gift for anybody: belly button lint picker. I have no idea where that came from. That came out of some recess of my gray matter. No, but you know what I'm talking about, right? It's a birthday. Oh, it's a birthday. I got to give them a gift. What am I going to give them? There's some people, it's just so hard to come up with a gift for them. What are you going to give Jesus? What are you going to give Jesus? See, when these guys are at their home in the east and they have to make this long journey. By the way, no doubt there has to be more than three, because what would three guys loaded up with treasure, what would happen to them on this long trip from the east? They're going to get robbed. This has to be a sizable group. That's the only way to have protection. These guys they're dignitaries. You can tell by the way that they're dressed and their retinue. These are wealthy guys. If it's three guys, they're going to get, waylaid by outlaws. So here they come, and they're setting out. What are we going to take? Well, who is he? What do the prophecies tell us? He's a king. But there must have been something else in there that kind of gave a hint of what his rule would be like and who he was. Because they bring gifts befitting of who he is. He's a king, so they bring gold. That's the gift that you bring to a king. But they bring frankincense as well. Who used frankincense? Priests. Frankincense was incense that you burned as you were worshiping, because it was a picture of your worship and your prayers going up before God. And myrrh, what is myrrh used for? Well, it was used for perfume. It's bitter, but you add some sweetness like honey to it, or a essential oil that has a sweet smell, and it takes on this very rich and long-lasting scent. It's beautiful. And so it was used in those wraps that they would put around a dead body, because people would need a time to be able to mourn. And so the body would be there, and people would come within close proximity to the body, and they would mourn before the tomb would be sealed. And it was just this way to, instead of being confronted with the smell of decay, instead your time of mourning is connected to this scent of sweetness. Because it's good and it's sweet and it's right that you're mourning the loss of this person. Make sense? And so myrrh, very expensive because it was hard to produce. It was made from the sap of a tree that was grown really out in the Jordan area. So it really speaks of this embalming spice. Why? Because Jesus is not only a king who gets gold and a priest who gets incense, but he's a prophet. What happens to prophets? They get killed because their message isn't usually received. And that is, in fact, what's going to happen to Jesus. He is our king. He is the priest that mediates between us and God. And he is the prophet who tells us the truth and gets killed for it. I wonder how Mary and Joe reacted to this visit by these Eastern dignitaries. Can you imagine that? They're peasants. And here they are in this house, probably one of their relatives there in Bethlehem, and she's recovering, and there's this news of there's somebody comes, hey, there's a group of these foreigners that are coming into town, and here, oh, okay, well, why are they here? And they open the door, and yes, we're here. Probably they had to pay an interpreter to interpret for them. And so in they come, and we saw a star, and we looked in our holy books, and we know the meaning. And of course, Mary and Joseph, they know who Jesus is. But imagine the impact that this would have on them. Please hear me, because what have Mary and Joseph had to deal with this whole time? Mary, yes, I'm pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Yeah, right. Sure you are. Yeah. Even Joseph was going to put her away. But the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, no, she's bearing the Messiah. And he mans up and stands by her side. Can you imagine the ridicule and the askance glances they got from everyone? And now, you have these foreign dignitaries that have made this long trip bearing these precious treasures, that they come in and they bow down and they worship Jesus and they lay their treasures at Mary's feet. We bear the scorn of this world because we are associated with Jesus. But the day is coming when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Okay, so the Magi have arrived. They've worshiped. They've gifted the family. Now it's time to start the long trek home. So what will they do? Herod told them to report back to him and because he's the king of the lands, and they're really kind of obligated to do so. They're really at Bethlehem at his permission. As foreigners and as dignitaries, they're there at his permission. What are they going to do? Verse 12, then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So imagine that conversation the next morning. Because this happened to all of them in a dream. Can you imagine these guys, they get up the next morning, it's time for them to leave, and wow, I had a crazy dream last night. Really? Me too. You did? Yeah. And then others are, wow, I did too. Was it something we ate? Maybe it was the anchovies on the pizza. Was it? Well, yeah, what was your dream? Well, I feel a little odd talking about it, but an angel appeared to me and told me that not to go back to Herod. That was my dream. My dream too. And obviously, they quickly realize, this is a message from heaven. So they depart another way. Why? See, they don't take the main route home. They would have to go through Jerusalem. That's the main highway. So they go out through covert route. And by the time Herod finally realizes these guys are not coming back, they're out of his territory and he no longer has jurisdiction over them. Verse 13, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. And so there was until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew quotes the prophet Hosea there, chapter 11, verse 1. Herod waited for the Magi to return with the identity and the location of the child, and when he realized that they were not going to report back to him, it only fueled his suspicion that something was going on. Why would they dodge him if there was nothing to hide? But Herod didn't need proof. He'd already decided what he would do. A guy who's paranoid enough that he kills his favorite wife and 3 sons is not going to bat an eye at offing some peasant's brat. He'd already decided on that course. How convenient to now have justification for doing it. Oh, they didn't return to me. There's obviously a conspiracy. They're trying to hide something. This is so typical of people who want to do what they know is wrong. They want to sin. They've already decided to do it, but then they latch on to any excuse to do it. God warned Joseph via a dream that Herod's going to come after Jesus. They needed to leave. And so he packs up Mary and the infant, and they head south to Egypt until Herod croaks and the threat is past. All of this fulfills the prophecy of Hosea 11. Now Matthew is going to backtrack a bit. Verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, and the word deceived here means tricked. Matthew casts this from Herod's perspective, not the motive of the Magi. They were not trying to trick Herod. They were obeying the heavenly message. But from Herod's paranoid view, they tricked him. He deemed them part of a conspiracy to steal his throne. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Now, verse 7 said, Herod inquired when the Magi originally saw the star. He calculated the time for them to see it, figure out what it meant, provision their caravan, and make the trip. And he figured that it had to have been more than a year. So just to make sure, he sends his troops to Bethlehem with the command to slay every boy 2 years and under. This is a shocking atrocity that sickens us with how cheaply Herod and his men treated life. And as tragic as it is, sad to say, it was not all that uncommon in the ancient world. History is replete with similar stories, with rulers who commanded entire families and villages wiped out for nothing more than an insult. Please hear me. Nothing has so elevated the value of human life as the gospel of Jesus Christ. We read stories like this and we're shocked by them, we're repulsed by them for one reason, because of Jesus. Because the Word of God, because this book right here starts out, right out, by telling us that human beings are created in the image of God. Jesus Christ comes to restore us to the image of God that was broken by the fall. The value of a human life is worth the blood of God. That's how much God values us. We do not obtain our value by looking at ourselves and drumming something up. Our value is derived by what God says about us and has proven how much He values us by sending His Son. But for most of history, human beings have been used as a commodity, an object to be used and manipulated and controlled by those in power. We read this story and it shocks us. It's repulsive to read how cavalierly Herod would treat these young children. But understand, this is the view of human beings apart from God. How many children were killed? We don't know. Probably several hundred. But how many children are aborted every year in this country? Verse 17, then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So Matthew refers to Jeremiah 31, where the prophet gives a lament of the mothers when Babylon destroyed the nation. That tragedy foreshadowed Herod's slaughter of the innocents here at Bethlehem. What makes Herod's act heinous was that he knew he was killing the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. How did he know that? Well, because the Magi came saying, we have come looking for him who was born King of the Jews, and the religious leaders went to the scriptures and knew where that would be. He was being driven by Satan, who's desperate to put an end to Christ, but will never be able to. Rather, Christ will put an end to him. Verse 19, now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. So once the threat was removed, it was safe to return home. In his book, Antiquities of the Jews, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus says that Herod died of, quote, should I read it? Ulcerated entrails, putrefied and maggot-filled organs, and constant convulsions, unquote. His breath was so foul, no one could share the same room with him. Nothing the physicians did could provide relief, and he died in terrible agony. He literally rotted to death. Lovely. I don't think myrrh worked for him. Verse 21. I'm so funny. No. Verse 21. Then he, that is Joseph, arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. So what Matthew is doing here is actually they were already in Nazareth. The other Gospels tell us that. He left that out of the story, and so he's just picking it up now as they return to actually where they were living before. So when the little family arrives back in Israel, they find that the throne is passed from Herod to his son, one of the sons he hadn't killed, Archelaus. Only time will tell if he was cut from the same cloth or he came from a different mold, Archelaus. God directed them to return to their digs in Nazareth. So this fulfilled the prophets saying that the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 1 is a clear messianic prophecy. Let me read that. Isaiah 11:1. There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The word for rod is the Hebrew word natsar and means to sprout or shoot. Jesus was the natsar prophesied by Isaiah. Doubly so, because not only was he from the line of Jesse, David's father, he grew up in Nazareth and would be known as Jesus of Nazareth. He was the Nazarene from Nazareth. Nazareth means sprout town, or we might say bean field. That's really what Nazareth means, bean field. It was a proverbial hick town of the time and region. You guys may remember that in John chapter 1, verse 46, when Philip is trying to convince his friend Nathanael that they had found the Messiah, he identified him as Jesus of Nazareth, and Nathanael's reply was an incredulous, "Oh, can anything good come out of Beantown?" Matthew turns the lowliness of Nazareth around and shows how God moves to fulfill prophecy, so surely it comes to pass in something as simple as the place where the Messiah grows up. He will be known as Jesus of Nazareth, Christ from Beantown, the sovereign King of the universe. Humbles and makes himself of no reputation. Why? So that he can identify with the smallest and the weakest and the most underprivileged of this world. And the entire life of Christ is one paradox after another. He is God incarnate. Yet when he comes into the world that he made, he enters through the womb of a Jewish teenage peasant. His first crib is a feeding trough. His first blankets are rough homespun. And though he's in truth the ruler of heaven, while an infant, he flees to Egypt from a petty tyrant. He grows up not in Rome, the cosmopolitan center of power, wealth, and education. It's a backwater burg. That is not the route to the throne that you and I would chart, is it? But it's the route that Jesus took, because his kingdom is not about force and domination, intimidation, physical might. He rules in righteousness and love. His kingdom lifts the weak and the downtrodden. It gives sight to the blind and sets free those who are bound by sin. He is forever. Never forget this. May this take on new meaning for you every time you hear it or read it. He is Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus, Yahweh saves. The name chosen for him by God. He is Yeshua. That's the name Gabriel said that they were to call him. That's a heaven-picked name. He's Yeshua, Jesus, from Nazareth, bean patch. A name of derision chosen by men. The name of Jesus isn't lowered by the addition of Nazareth. Rather, Nazareth is exalted by the addition of the name of Jesus. You and I aren't much in and of ourselves. We are just clay. We are dust. Dust in the wind. But the Spirit of God dwells in us. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit. All because he came for us.